If we open Final Fantasy VIII's instruction booklet that came with the game in its original release for the PS1, one of the first things we see is this introduction to its story and main characters. On the left page, the text reads, "In Final Fantasy VIII, the player will assume the roles of Squall and Laguna to advance the story." And on the right, the two of them are highlighted as the game's main characters before anyone else, even the other party members that were permanently playable, unlike Laguna, who is only playable in certain sections of the game. That's because, as these two pages suggest, Final Fantasy VIII was conceived from the start as a story with two protagonists, as the text on the right hints at. Squall and Laguna, two men linked mysteriously by fate. The friends, rivals, and beautiful women whom they encounter all come together to create a striking and moving drama. But despite this clear indication of his centrality and importance to Final Fantasy VIII from an official source, from what I've seen, some fans still seem to struggle to understand Laguna's role and relevance to the overall narrative of Final Fantasy VIII, with some even downplaying his importance. Heck, even the marketing people at Square Enix overlooked him when promoting the recent Final Fantasy VIII remaster, with Laguna not showing up even once during the official trailer for it. And that's what motivated me to do this video, to explain why I think Laguna plays a crucial role in Final Fantasy VIII's narrative, why his story was essential to accomplishing what the game set out to do, and why it's a big part of what makes Final Fantasy VIII special. The way I'll be doing that is by presenting and expounding upon three main reasons why Laguna and his story were essential to Final Fantasy VIII. Now, these aren't necessarily the only things that make his side of the story relevant and worthwhile. I could name other reasons, like, for example, providing historical background for the world of Final Fantasy VIII, but the following three are the ones I consider to be the most important, and they're all interconnected. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Oh, and of course, expect spoilers. Reason 1. Parallel narratives. One very obvious way in which Laguna's story enriches Final Fantasy VIII is by providing a parallel narrative to the story of Squall. This is a well-established literary device that is employed in various novels. Parallel narratives are a particularly interesting form of non-linear storytelling in which the plot jumps around between different timelines and protagonists. This can serve many purposes, such as providing multiple perspectives on a common theme, which is indeed one of the main functions of Laguna's story that we'll explore in more detail later, but it also serves as a strong narrative hook, as the audience seeks to unravel the mystery and uncover the connection between the two seemingly separate stories. At first, this connection is very tenuous and rather unclear, but over time we slowly gather information that helps us gradually piece things together, which I find to be a very stimulating and rewarding process. And in my opinion, this really helps make Final Fantasy VIII stand out from other games in the series, with this format of two parallel narratives with two different protagonists, making its storyline that much more unique and intriguing, especially as the two narratives progress and we see how everything ultimately ties up together, culminating, of course, in the discovery that we were playing as father and son all along. Pretty ingenious if you ask me. Now, as much as I enjoy this aspect of Final Fantasy VIII, I have to admit that it's a shame that they didn't go as far with it as they had originally planned, since, in the original concept for the game, the time allotted to each narrative was to be evenly divided, and you'd actually play half the runtime of the game as Laguna. Kazushige Nojima, the game's lead writer, confirmed this himself in an interview with Famitsu celebrating the game's 20th anniversary. In his own words, "At first, Laguna's parts were much bigger. They were making around half of Final Fantasy VIII, but as development went on, they got shorter and shorter. The staff worked really hard to make a map for Laguna's parts too, but in the end, it's barely used in the final game. I always felt bad about that and couldn't apologize enough to the staff." This information is further corroborated by cut content found within the game data, which includes, among other things, the pickup truck that Laguna is seen driving in his intro picture, as well as the title of planned but ultimately cut FMVs called Laguna/Squall Watching the Moon, which brings to mind this promotional CG artwork. For those of us who really enjoyed Laguna's side of the story, this is really tantalizing information, as one can only imagine what could have been. But nevertheless, what we got of Laguna's story still greatly enriched the experience of Final Fantasy VIII and made good use of the literary device of parallel narratives to create an intriguing storyline with a fun mystery to unravel. And of course, it also made for some of the most exciting scenes in the game when the two stories finally converge and the heroes of the present get to meet the now aged heroes of the past, and the two groups join forces to defeat the enemy from the future. Reason 2. Tonal balance. Laguna's side of the story was also helpful in achieving a certain tonal balance in Final Fantasy VIII's narrative by providing a refreshing change of pace with a more experienced and easygoing group of heroes, and especially a more affable and less troubled protagonist who doesn't worry too much and keeps moving forward, calling back to classic Final Fantasy main characters like Bards from Final Fantasy V or Locke from Final Fantasy VI. The developers themselves have indicated that Laguna was deliberately made to be the opposite of Squall, precisely because Squall was so different from traditional Final Fantasy heroes, to the point that he didn't even understand the value of friendship at first. And thus, we get Laguna, Kyros, and Ward, who are older and more experienced than Squall's group, and have been close friends for a long time, and therefore share a deep bond of trust and mutual understanding. In the aforementioned interview with Famitsu, Kazushige Nojima himself pointed out how Laguna's relationship with his comrades heavily contrasted with Squall's, calling to mind how Renoa at some points says she can't understand Squall unless he says what he's thinking. Meanwhile, Kyros and Ward always understand Laguna before he even says anything. It's even been suggested in other sources that the way Laguna's friends talk with each other was based on the way the staff working in the Squaresoft offices spoke. So yeah, basically, as compelling as the character's study of Squall is, his aloof and withdrawn disposition made him an atypical hero with an uneasy relationship with his teammates, and therefore Laguna and his friends were a good way to give players a taste of the classic Final Fantasy band of heroes, thus preventing the audience from being too overwhelmed by the teenage angst of our somewhat dysfunctional adolescent heroes. As I said earlier, all these reasons are interconnected, and thus this intentional contrast between Squall and Laguna brings us to the last and most important reason why Laguna was essential to Final Fantasy VIII. Reason 3. Laguna serves as a foil to Squall to complement Final Fantasy VIII's exploration of its main themes. A foil is another literary device that Final Fantasy VIII makes great use of through Laguna, who serves as the foil character to Squall. A foil character is one whom the author designs to contrast with another character, usually the protagonist, in some meaningful way. Oftentimes, foils take the form of two characters whose behaviors and attitudes differ. We see this quite clearly in Final Fantasy VIII in the juxtaposition of Squall and Laguna, who are very much polar opposites. Squall is brooding and aloof, Laguna is carefree and approachable. Squall is usually serious, Laguna is often playful. Squall is very analytical and usually thinks things through before making a statement or decision, while Laguna is very spontaneous and doesn't usually ponder things before answering or acting. Squall tends to hide his feelings, whereas Laguna is open about his and basically wears his heart on his sleeve. I could go on, but I think you see the point. Although, let me make clear that I'm not trying to suggest that Laguna is perfect in every way compared to Squall. Every Final Fantasy VIII character is flawed to a greater or lesser extent, and Laguna is no exception. Just ask Rain. He can be scattered and impulsive, and his carefree nature does lapse into carelessness at times, whereas Squall is more prudent and thorough, which makes him more reliable in certain situations. Now, all of these contrasting traits of Squall and Laguna are, of course, especially true at the beginning of their respective story arcs, since both of them grow over the course of the game, especially Squall, who has a very broad character arc. And their growth and life story is essentially shaped by the way each of them tackles the questions that serve as Final Fantasy VIII's main themes. Now, when we bring up the subject of the main themes of a game, inevitably each player is going to have a slightly different idea of what exactly those themes are. As you may know, the developers themselves have stated on multiple occasions that the main theme they were going for with Final Fantasy VIII was love. And I'm obviously not going to dispute that, but when it comes to the juxtaposition of Squall and Laguna as foils, I think a more precise designation for the themes they're meant to provide a different perspective on would be human relationships and time. Humans are temporal creatures, and therefore human relationships are not only dynamic and ever-changing, but also necessarily transient and ephemeral, which begs the question: how do people deal with separation and loss, and with the awareness of their inevitability in the course of time? Both Squall and Laguna experienced painful losses in their lives. Laguna was separated from Julia before their love could be consummated, but then met Rain and fell in love with her, only for her to die tragically before he was able to return to her side, and then alone was sent to the orphanage before sailing away on the elusive White Seed ship. So Laguna lost both of the women he loved and the girl that was like a daughter to him. Meanwhile, Squall was sent to an orphanage after the death of his mother, and his sis, Elone, who was his only source of emotional support, soon went away and disappeared from his life, and the trauma of that separation and loss continued to haunt Squall and to shape his personality well into the present. So we've established that both Squall and Laguna experienced deeply painful losses, but of course, the key difference between them is the way in which they responded to those losses and the pain they felt. Now, in the interest of fairness, we must recognize that their circumstances were also different, as Squall experienced those separations and losses when he was still a young child, whereas we know nothing about Laguna's childhood or even adolescence. So it's quite possible, and even likely I would say, that he got dealt a better hand than Squall. But nevertheless, there's clearly lessons that Squall needs to learn. That's what Final Fantasy VIII's story is mainly about. And part of what makes their dichotomy so interesting is that Laguna already embodies some of those lessons. Squall's scene with Kistis in the training center shows us early on how he sees human relationships at the start of the game. He believes each person should handle and endure their own feelings and take care of their own problems instead of burdening other people with them. So he's very emotionally unavailable to those around him. Whereas Laguna is almost the complete opposite, being emotionally available to and concerned with basically everyone around him, even complete strangers like the rebels in Estar, as well as non-human creatures like the Moomba he cares for while in prison. Again, this is what makes Laguna a perfect foil to Squall, and this is his main role in the story of Final Fantasy VIII, to complement its exploration of the challenges of human relationships within the boundaries of time by showing us a different and healthier way of responding to separation and loss. Squall's response was, of course, to close himself off and keep everyone at arm's length so he wouldn't have to go through that kind of pain again. He became so afraid of feeling that pain that he didn't even want to form new relationships and vowed to be able to get by on his own without help or support from anyone. But of course, this was largely a coping mechanism, and it ultimately meant that he was shutting himself off from life and from the things that make it truly worthwhile and rewarding. And that's why Squall is in such a dark place at the start of the game, with no dreams, no aspirations, no passions, no desires or hopes. He just wants to do his duty and keep himself busy with his job, essentially because it keeps him from thinking about the emptiness of his life. It's pretty depressing actually. And that's where Laguna comes in to show us another way. Whereas the pain of loss made Squall close himself off, Laguna kept his heart open and, if anything, became more sensitive and attentive to the suffering of others. Knowing separation, he merely wishes for the happiness of the person he parted ways with, while striving to enjoy each moment in his present relationships. Knowing pain, he understands the importance of compassion and is open and available to helping others with their issues, even complete strangers. Knowing loss, he honors the memory of the loved one he lost with a wistful smile on his face, and remains open to forming and cherishing other relationships and connections. Honestly, he is the embodiment of a quote from Aragorn in the Lord of the Rings books. His grief he will not forget, but it will not darken his heart. It will teach him wisdom. And that's the beautiful contrast that Laguna offers to Squall as his foil character. Grief and time definitely darkened Squall's heart and made him wounded, while Laguna became wiser. And that's why I love their scene together in the city of Duodecim, where Laguna imparts some of that wisdom to Squall in his own unique and endearing style. If you're a Final Fantasy VIII fan and you haven't seen it yet, I definitely recommend checking it out. Well, that's about it. To sum it up, even though Laguna ended up not having the necessary screen time to be considered Squall's equal, like in the original plan for the game, he still played a central and crucial role in the overall narrative of Final Fantasy VIII, and his side of the story was still profoundly important for all of the aforementioned reasons, most notably the way it enhanced and complemented Squall's own story arc and the game's larger exploration of its main themes. But, and I have to say this, even if Laguna's story didn't contribute as much to plot lines other than itself, in my opinion, it would still be worth including and experiencing, and the game just wouldn't be the same without it, because it's just A beautiful, bittersweet, and inspirational story of a man whose life is plagued by loss after loss, and yet he never loses the joy of living and always keeps his heart open to those around him. Basically, Squall's journey is the soul of Final Fantasy VIII, but Laguna provides its heart. Well, I leave you with that. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, then please give it a thumbs up and share it around, and if you haven't subscribed yet, then consider doing it since I've got more fun videos on Final Fantasy and other stuff that you might be interested in. Alright, that's all for now. See you next time, Chocobros!